welcome to another episode of The Unknown Film Enthusiast. Today we're talking about The Rise of a King in Black Panther. I am Zach, and my guest here today
is Nick, as always.
As always. Alright, so we're going to start by talking about, once again, basically overall perception of the film, and we'll start with our critic ratings as well as just the general overview from IMDb, the golden source of all good things about movies. And interesting trivia.
Yeah.
All
Always. Right. None of it's useless. So, just to start off, the IMDb plot synopsis says, T'Challa, the king of Wakanda, rises to the throne in the isolated, technologically advanced African nation, but his claim is challenged by a vengeful outsider who was a childhood victim of T'Challa's father's mistake.
Dun, dun, dun. Ominous.
Spooky. So, just to get us started, just to go through the ratings a little bit. On IMDb, it's currently rated a 7.9. On the Roger Ebert website, it has 4 stars, which is the highest rating it can get. And on Rotten Tomatoes, it is the highest rated superhero movie of all time, with a 97% critic rating. Keep in mind, it is also a 79% user rating. So whether that's people being angry, because I know they're in the beginning, people were like, oh, we should petition to make sure it doesn't get great reviews because people are dumb. So I'm happy we're past that.
Yeah, and obviously, we should probably start out by saying that this is those reviews tell us it is one of the most remarkable, fantastic, superhero movies of all time. If you look at the data and the numbers.
And is that what you got from it?
I personally didn't get that. I thought it was a very classic cookie cutter kind of. And maybe cookie cutter is not the best way to describe it, but cookie cutter Marvel movie where it's a superhero movie. I knew what I was getting, but I think what is probably more impactful, which made it a more important film, was having a setting in Africa with this Wakandan nation that is highly technological. I think cultural relevance is what sent this movie from just average superhero movie to cultural phenomenon.
And, in general, I would agree with that, but does that really give it the merits to be revered as one of the best? Because I have a similar issue with Wonder Woman, where I think the first 90% of that movie is great, and then the third act kind of falls off. But people absolutely adore it because of that, and I can't get mad because I like the movie. I just don't think it's perfect, and I don't get why it either has to be perfect or trash.
Yeah, I think most of these movies, the general audience member, if you're going to see something like this, it's easier to always think in those extremes. You're right. It's either perfect or trash in someone's mind because thinking anywhere in that gray middle area is more complex. So with this film, you're right. I think going out a couple years and looking back in, is it going to be seen as an absolutely perfect film? No, because it's not a perfect film. It's a very good, interesting film that has an archetype kind of storyline that we've probably heard, hundreds of times since the beginning of human history, and it's just told from the perspective of an isolated nation in Africa that has the potential not the potential, is the most technologically advanced society on Earth. That cultural element is what I think people are, grasping onto the most to say it's so influential. So, go back to the original question. No,
okay.
just because it has that cultural, relevancy and talking about how great this African nation is, I don't think that's what makes it a fantastic film, though. And that's maybe what we could get into a little bit, later, because the cultural stuff does really come out a lot, and what that means for sharing and basically, if we go really into it, Killmonger's motivation in this film.
Yes, which I find rather interesting, and. Just in the beginning of this, I'm just going to say he's probably my favorite Marvel villain of all time.
Yeah.
So, I think we will get into our featured review of Black Panther.
Wakanda does not need a warrior right now. We need a king.
All right. So, beginning with our general thoughts about this film, personally, I think we can both say we definitely liked it. Yeah. So maybe we can pick out some of the elements of that way, our thoughts about why we generally liked it. So if you want to start with that.
Well, as I said in our beginning segment, I really like the villain. I think of basically any, not even just Marvel movie, superhero movie, he has the most motivation to have done what he did. And for most of the movie, I was kind of rooting for him until he kind of took a more villainous turn. But I guess we'll go more into that later. Just the aesthetic of it, I thought it was very beautiful, and just the world building within a short period of time. I feel like they let us know all the parts of this tribe, the entire
history.
the history, the culture, everything about it. And yeah, just visually it was very interesting, and character-wise, it is one of the few non-Avengers movies that I would really call like an ensemble movie.
Yeah.
Because yeah, every single part of them I hope, and based on the trailers, I think they're all going to show up in Avengers Infinity War. But yeah, that's just a few of the things that I liked. What about you?
Yeah. I mean, I'll say the same thing. The history was definitely very cool because, coming from, I don't know the comic books, and this is, when I talk about Marvel, I come from the perspective of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So if you're going to introduce me to a new character, I need to know not only who the character is, but the world that he comes out of. So, and the way they did that was very visually pleasing as well. And then it kind of incites the whole question of the film, which Killmonger, being a great complex villain, was if you have this technology, what is your responsibility? How do you kind of use it? Is it your responsibility to share it or isolate the world from it so no one else can really know about it with good intention? They isolate themselves so they're not hurting anybody else, I think, is the long kind of con is not the right word, but the long game there. And in terms of the film itself, I think it was good for the case that it has very interesting elements. What I mean by that is, like I said, I like the history parts. I like the relationship between T'Challa and Killmonger, and I like kind of how it plays out with the the Americans intervening, and of course Andy Serkis's character, underutilized, I would say,
Criminally
underutilized, but very interesting. So characters were very strong. Then on the negative aspect of that, and which we can probably get into now, is I like those pieces. But I think this film is where I'm starting to get more of that Marvel movie fatigue, where it's like those pieces fit into the, A squared plus B squared equals C squared, formula that is a Marvel movie, which begins to distract from how good the movie is, because I'm like, oh, I know what's going to happen next. I don't know exactly what's going to happen next, but I know the beat that they're going to hit next.
And that's, I feel like it almost undermines some of the better moments of this movie, because they start off in an unexpected way, they go someplace different in the middle, and then by the end they have to wrap back around, because in the end it is a Marvel movie.
Yep.
And it's what makes them all good movies, because they stick to this formula of not going too far into the realm of absurd or anything. But it also is what prevents them from being phenomenal, because it serves to limit their potential, just in a way. And yeah, just a couple things that I wasn't a big fan of was, in a lot of movies, jokes work. And if you refer back to our Star Wars review, you can see a movie where we did not feel that the jokes did work. And I feel that the biggest part of this is not making your movie a time capsule. And even at this point in time, and even more in 5 years from now, I feel like the "what are those" jokes and the "whip my hair back and forth" joke are not going to age well. No. Your personal thoughts on that?
Same thing. And I also got to the point, and again, it stems from my issue with the Marvel formula. At some point there's going to be a joke or a laugh line thrown in there. And when they go to the tribe that is not part of, like, the one that lives in the mountains, and they have the gorillas, and they have this big, like, burly guy or whatever, he's meant to be intimidating, but he can't be too intimidating, so we have to throw in a laugh line where he's like, oh, I don't care, or whatever. It's like, it's just
we're vegetarians.
Yeah, we're vegetarians. It's just like, that makes sense, and it's comedy for comedy's sake. From this, standpoint of the Marvel formula, we know we need to have comedy in here to lighten up the mood and get us to the next one, because, if you're in that jovial attitude, you're ready for a switch to the next serious beat kind of thing.
But at the same time, a movie doesn't have to be all serious or all joke, and I feel like the Marvel movies tend to follow more there's going to be a lot of jokes and some serious things can happen around them, but we're not going to get the full seriousness of it. That being said, I do think this is one of the more has the most gravity of a lot of the Marvel movies, with characters dying that you don't quite expect, the backstories being a lot more tormented, and just seeing the struggles of rising to power, and a lot more complexity to every single character than I think we generally expect in most movies, most superhero movies, including like Origins, because generally it only gives the main character time in the spotlight. But this one, almost every single character introduced, including the villain, is given a perfect amount of time to let you know exactly why they're there and what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and maybe that's, talking about it now and the way you kind of phrase that kind of brought into my head the idea of we are now at, as you said, like, or mentioned, like the 18th Marvel movie, they've had time to perfect and refine. Now, we've said that they don't have necessarily the formula to take big risks to go huge and phenomenal, but they know that they need to refine their characters, because if you're going to go and invest yourself in a universe, the way that you're going to invest in that universe is through the eyes of the characters.
Yeah.
So, but I also think in this case specifically, the story, like, superheroes are modern mythology. That is exactly what they are, and whether you accept it or not, I disagree with you.
That's on you.
That's on you. But the story of brother killing brother, that disjointed person going out and raising themselves to prepare to overthrow the so-called rightful ruler, like, that's not a atypical story. That is by definition an archetype story. So now what Marvel had to do was make sure that those characters that are in there are represented in a way that makes their motivation seem meaningful. And I think that the way that Killmonger was portrayed, the reason it resonated so much was because we, as the 21st century global community, are like, yeah, he's absolutely right. Like, we've gone from this entire history of, the African continent being colonized and torn apart, and now we found out, like, as a global community, that this Wakandan nation is by far the most incredible thing on the planet, and they've been isolated and haven't shared with the world, and as they're not sharing, they're causing the people of African heritage to just be basically taken advantage of. They're in the wrong there.
Completely.
So, and that's, I think that's what's beautiful about it, and maybe that's what makes it so powerful then, is you have the wonderful story archetype with now an actual political and meaningful way to talk about the, African people on their continent.
He's not a villain for the sake of being a villain. He reflects, I think, a lot of people in the audience's beliefs. My own personal beliefs is, if you have that technology and there are people literally in the nation next to you that are struggling, it is very selfish not to share it.
Yeah.
And I understand the concerns of, what if they weaponize it or they don't understand, but it's just wrong. And then obviously that's reflected in the end with the smart nations build bridges while stupid ones build barriers, and it's very of our time and all times that have passed. But and just the idea of the colonizers being the ones in the wrong, and it made perfect sense, and just everything behind Killmonger just fit in perfectly and made him such an interesting person to follow.
Yeah. And I think this is the heart of the conversation that is happening, not only with us, but with everyone as well. Like, when you talk to a person about this movie, they are, I think, mostly right there with, they enjoyed the plot because it is relevant to our time as well as to our history as well. Like, and when I say our history, I'm saying now as a global community as well. I'm not just saying American, African history, Asian history. One thing that's nice about these, or what I think these Marvel movies are trying to do, is say we are a global community, which we'll definitely see in Infinity War. And how are we going to kind of answer that? And with the Wakandan nation as well, this also just kind of came to my mind when we were talking about it. It's like, can you blame them for not wanting to share their technology, kind of thing, to share this essentially gift from the stars, which is exactly what it is? Can you blame them for making that decision early on and then sticking to their traditions? Because I think that's what another part of this film is. Is it better to stay with your traditions, what you've always done, or is it better to be progressive and listen to this, listen to the global community. Listen to Killmonger saying we need to share this to help our brothers who have been oppressed for so long.
Is it better to stay in the Dark Ages or have a Renaissance?
Oh, interesting.
Mr. History.
Yeah, and I mean, I would argue that the Dark Ages is a fallacy,
Yeah.
but like, you're right. But the Renaissance doesn't come out, and this is also, I'm saying the word Renaissance here, meaning rebirth. The reason the Renaissance occurred was because of the seeds that were planted in the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages don't happen because no one is sharing things. No, it's because communities that were once together and unified by a grand, basically conquered the Mediterranean Sea complex at least, but they unified the nation. The Dark Ages happened because that unity went away. Now, when you don't have a unifier, you have to fight the person next to you to get what you think you deserve. Then the Renaissance comes about when they realize, I'm not just going to fight these people, I'm going to trade with them. And then you have global politics.
I feel like that is the part of this movie that they almost gloss over, is there is in the opening, there's a history telling scene.
Mm-hmm.
And you see, this is how the tribe started, this is how they found the vibranium, this is how everything came together.
Yeah.
Skip forward 3,000 years, here's where we are now.
Yeah.
And they show that things are happening around the world, and they keep referring to this isolation. But to what extent, obviously people didn't know about the Black Panther or what he did, but what's the limit? I feel like it ends up in this weird gray zone where it's very interesting in the beginning and it's interesting where it ended up, but it would be nice to know exactly what brought them to these middle stages, because I can understand the logic, but you would think that through time, and clearly they have a UN presence based on Civil War.
They're not completely isolated.
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah.
But what is the extent of that? And I feel that's how you get into Star Wars prequels territory, is when you start talking about trade negotiations. But that's the one thing that I think I want a little bit more of in this.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, you can't just have a history movie. Maybe they'll make prequels about T'Chaka instead of T'Challa, and just have the interesting thing be about that. But it's a well fleshed out world, but I still kind of wish there was a little bit more in existence. And maybe I should read a comic book, because maybe they go into it there.
That's probably.
I don't know about that though.
But then again, you as an audience member, like, these are designed so that you don't have to go do that. If you are interested, go ahead and buy a comic book.
And I feel like that's a reasonable divide, because if that intro sequence was any longer, I feel like a lot of people would have checked out.
Yeah.
You and me probably would have been fine, because we both like our history lessons.
Yeah.
And just going back to that opening, and this is something I hadn't thought about until I've seen the movie twice at this point. When I first saw it, I imagined it being T'Chaka telling T'Challa the story of the history, but looking back, it's Killmonger being told by his father the history, and that's what makes it so much more beautiful in his journey, because he's constantly being described this fairy tale, and then in the end, just this little boy from California believing in fairy tales, can you believe that? And it's just, it comes full circle.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I appreciate his story so much more, and at the same time I think it kind of undermines a little bit of what the movie's trying to say, because of just, there's a difference between having a compelling villain and a villain that you ultimately agree with. And with the exception of about 2 scenes where Killmonger has the villain moment, where he chokes someone and says something about, we gotta get guns out there, everything he says and does is very understandable. Even from the first line of, do you think your people bought this, or did they just come in and take it? Everything makes perfect sense, and he is a rightful heir to the throne and deserved to win in ritual combat. Personally, I think based on his agenda, I would have been killed. But I fundamentally agreed with him on almost every level, which makes me somewhat hesitant to yet again. I don't think it's a perfect movie, but it pulls that even farther away from the perfect movie and leads me to say, well, there's flawed heroes and there's interesting villains, but they can't go too far in either direction.
Well, then I think, that's kind of what it really gets to, is the reason you have that break with that character is because at some point he says, the way that we're going to enact this global change is by giving people weapons that will cause mass killings.
But that didn't feel like this was his revelation. It felt like we were in the third act of this movie revelation. So obviously, in the end, it's still a movie.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing it the second time, I appreciated it a lot more because it gave me time to focus on the action. Because another big takeaway from this is because of the universal praise that it's getting, it's almost being set up to an unrealistic expectation.
Yeah.
And then if you go out in the world and say that, oh, it wasn't my favorite, you might be met with disbelief or people just not liking you based on the fact that you had a disagreeing opinion from someone, or assume that there's an ulterior motive, which, without saying it, I think we can all be pretty aware of what that might be if you just go around saying, oh, I hate this movie and everything it stands for.
And again, the cultural relevance is definitely something we'll get to as well. But before we kind of get into that, I would just want to take the last kind of section of this, because we have kind of talked about that formula, and I do think it's important to say we talked about how there's a great history lesson. It's a very interesting superhero lesson, but one thing that we mentioned earlier was this also had the element of the like kind of spy thriller as well, which I thought was I was like, oh, this is so cool, all the cool gadgets, like his suits and the necklace, and he has like all of like the EMPs stuff. But I absolutely, like I said, that's one aspect that I really really liked, because that was relatively new. Like, I never thought I'd see a spy thriller, in the middle of this movie, essentially, which was really cool.
Yeah, and it's that again adds to the familiarity of this kind of formula, because I wonder if there's another franchise that's been doing spy movies similar to this for the last 50 years. This movie is, for the middle section, does play out similar to a James Bond movie. There is the man in the lab coat who hands him all the things and says, oh, this is how this works, and this is how this works, and don't mess with it, and bring it back in one piece, or I'll have your hide. And then he goes into a casino and has a CIA friend, Felix Leiter, who is there to assist him in this. And the whole thing goes down very similar, and that's it's another reason why I love it. But yeah, I feel like it borrows just the right amount from everything and sticks to its formula a little bit too much, but it's not a bad movie. That's not the angle that any of us are trying to get at, but it just, does it deserve to be revered as the best? I'm not quite sure, but time will tell.
And this kind of comes down to like I think with the resounding final question here, is this important because of how culturally progressive it is, or is it essentially just a quality film? I think that would be like, that's really the fundamental question that we're dealing with here.
What are you writing? Another review? Is it any good? Is it? Is it bad? Did you even see this? Let me read it.
I will call the police.
So for that final question of what makes this so progressive, or is it a really quality film, the final question here is it a film about representation that made it so good and in the eyes of the public, or is it a question of it is a quality film that made it such a good film in the eyes of the public? So personally, representation-wise, there is the resounding idea of this is finally representing a positive view of the African continent. That's something that I think has resounded throughout all of the social medias and all of that. And even in the theater, I remember hearing someone like behind us whisper something. I was like, when they mentioned Benin, and they're like, "Oh, that's where we're from." To there, and I was like, "Oh wow!" Like that's something. I was like, "Oh, that's incredible. That's very powerful." And then also seeing the kids taking pictures next to the Black Panther big posters that they have in like the lobbies. That is something that is extremely, extremely important, because like Wonder Woman, in the same way, they, African American people have, and not African American people, African people that are in the entire globe can have a multi-million-dollar movie represent their country in a positive, interesting, and it's a fun movie as well. It's all positive, and they're like, finally, why is it taking this long?
And obviously, I don't think many people were worried about box office for this movie, but at this point, it is the second highest grossing Marvel movie behind the Avengers, and I believe has the second highest second week theater box office gross of all time, which is pretty fantastic for this. Until a few years ago, you would just say, oh, this, he's like a third tier superhero. But no, he's finally being brought into the spotlight. And it's that sort of representation that I think people are just clinging to, because it's similar to when I saw Wonder Woman, there was a 6-year-old girl who was jumping up and cheering every time Gal Gadot was on the screen, and that just made me so genuinely happy. And similar to what you were saying in this theater, there were kids taking pictures, there were parents being happy that it's a good role model, and that's That's the most important thing here. And does that make the movie better? No. Does it make it memorable? Yes. And I think we're lucky to have a movie of this quality showing off something like that. Because you can show it to the 5-year-old and say, this is a fun superhero movie, and then you can show it to an adult and be like, this is good representation, and there is an underlying message of togetherness, which I feel
Most
like
definitely.
it's a key part of this, and that's why it's working so well
And when you
across
look
the
at
world.
and when you look at any film, like, again, I don't, and you kind of brought this up earlier when you talked about the jokes, like, it should not be a time capsule for a time necessarily, but it's important to also know the context of the film as well. And talking about a film that finally has a context, of a very positive context, of saying we're finally, showing this super technological, advanced, interpretation of Africa, where they're giving the pride and the power to, people of African descent. That's incredible and never seen before. So culturally, it's an important film for that reason. Then on the other side of this question, quality-wise, and we've talked about this in the previous sections, but quality-wise, the film is good.
Yeah, it's a real good movie.
And like it's sad. It's sad, but it's also being a realist. If you were going to look at anything from cultural importance and film importance as well, like what's actually on, the film, it's you can say something's extremely culturally important even if it's not the best film ever made. And when you look at in terms of quality as well in superhero movies, because it is important to also say it is a superhero movie.
Yeah.
So how does this quality, if we're gonna create a litmus test, say quality wise Black Panther to the best superhero movies of all time? If you go back to, and again, this is also all right from my perspective, best movies of all time, because we talked about this.
Yeah, obviously it's subjective. And the thing you have to remember is for every movie you see, it's probably somebody's favorite movie.
Mm-hmm.
And based on Twitter reactions and various reviews I've seen of this movie, it is some people's favorite, not just superhero movie, but just one of their favorite movies of all time.
Yeah. And I think, the reason I'm bringing that up is because when this whole MCU got kicked off, it was very powerfully sent off by Iron Man, and a very cool representation of Iron Man. And Robert Downey Jr., I think also his portrayal of him is also really what helped, because he was like the most perfect and ideal person to play him.
Exactly, yeah.
And then you have films like, Dark Knight, which we, everyone talks about, because Dark Knight...
What's that one about?
It's just some bat dude.
Oh.
But,
Bat man?
No, bad dude.
Oh, bad dude.
But I think it's just, in terms of like that, for whatever reason, that film, and again, maybe that's also a little bit of nostalgia, perhaps, but that film was also that was what I would say when you ask, what is the defining moment of superhero movies in, the beginning of the 21st century, the first 20 years of it at least, like, oh wow, that Dark Knight movie with Heath Ledger as the Joker, whew, that's what a superhero movie really can be. When you look at franchise, then you look at Marvel. So that's what makes it a little bit different in terms of quality, in my opinion.
Dark Knight had the longevity of the movie. The MCU has the longevity of keeping a consistent quality throughout, at this point, almost a decade.
Yeah.
And that's it's impressive that arguably there are some that are obviously a bit lower tier than the rest, but they haven't made a bad movie, like arguably a bad movie, since they kicked off 10 years ago. And Black Panther is a continued step in the right direction.
And it is incredible to say that we have, 18 movies at this point. We have Infinity War coming up that is really going to be, I guess this is the end of phase 3 at this.
Yes.
Okay. So, and then it'll go on into, I guess the second part of Infinity War. This is going to be a huge culmination this summer as well. And Wakanda is going to play a central part in that film.
And that, I think, if you told someone that the starting point for one of the biggest movies of all time, because let's not kid ourselves, is 10 years in the making. I believe the budget for the two movies combined is $1 billion, which is unheard of. The fact that part of the movie, yet again, just based on trailers and bits of story things that I've seen, takes place in Wakanda. I don't think anyone would have believed that 10 years ago. And it's just, it is a marvel that all of this has come together so well.
And just, I think we can both agree that this is a good film, and once you kind of have that macro lens back on the Marvel Universe, the MCU is just a Marvel. I can't, damn it, I took it from you. I took it and then I made it worse. That's what I'm most disappointed about. But it was very, very a good film, and obviously if you're, most of America has seen it, so it's not like we're gonna get you out.
This is not the little engine that could. This is the one that made a lot of money and will probably keep making a lot of money.
Now we have 18 movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but the question is, if we know Infinity War is going to be centralized, how would you connect this in just 6 movies to Signs?
Signs?
Signs.
Well, first I would look at the marvelous upcoming actor, Daniel Kaluuya, who was in Get Out, among other things, such as Sicario, a personal favorite. But he was in Get Out with the actor Bradley Whitford, who was in Cabin in the Woods with Fran Kranz, who you might remember from the movie The Village, directed by M. Night Shyamalan, who directed Signs.
Oh my goodness.
Signs, sealed, delivered. It's Signs.
Once again, I still cannot wait for the day that I'm able to stump you with our 6 steps to Signs.
It'll never happen.
Thank you once again so much for listening to the Unknown Film Enthusiast and our thoughts and opinions about Black Panther. Thank you once again for being with us, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Bye-bye.